Well, good people, it's that time of year once again, when we stoke the fire and pour out cider, crack nuts, and swap stories. No doubt there'll be young ones coming about, dressed up as ghosts and goblins looking for a treat, as is the neighborly custom. Or perhaps we'll be visited by something stranger. Well now, don't be a stranger. Grab a mug and take a seat. The tale I have for you tonight is quite the treat. It came to me by way of neighborly custom, after all. I call it the Crow Mother. Many years ago, when I first came to the valley, I made the rounds to introduce myself to all the folks about. Back in the hill country where I was raised, it was a good practice to make the acquaintance of the local gentry, if for no other reason than to not be mistaken for a poacher. I was surprised to discover that the habit had not caught on here in Flatland, and the reception that I received at many a door ranged from bewilderment to embarrassment. This is a way one can tell that one has arrived in a truly metropolitan area. I've heard of these places, these melting pots of culture, and here was such a wonder. The residents of one house couldn't understand that I was not there to sell them something, and another, clearly immigrants from the Midwest, stumbled over themselves to apologize for not having stopped by sooner to welcome us to the neighborhood. The neighbor that stands out the most to me, however, was this older lady that lived at the end of the street. Lois was her name, and she lived in a house, more like a cottage, built of native sandstone brought down from the hills nearby. She was sitting on her front porch, shelling peas as I walked up the road. I announced myself at the gate, and she invited me up to set a spell. It was the first time I had felt at home all day. Lois had been around longer than anyone, and when I had those strange goings-on with the marbles and whatnot, you recall the affair, she shared a bit more of the story of the old Emerson place. Emerson, that was the name of the family that lived in the old farmhouse that so curiously invaded my dreams last year. Frank was the man who lived there, along with his wife Eileen and a little boy whose name was Robert. The Emersons were kin to Lois on Eileen's side. After what had happened, and with no other relatives to claim the property, the old farm had come to one of her uncles, who had attempted to fix up the place, but abandoned the attempt after a few months, and eventually resigned to haul the stones down to build the cottage. There was something off about that place from the very start, she said. Long before the farmhouse was constructed, there was a log cabin sitting right there in the same footprint. That well house you found over there? The woman gestured in the direction of my backyard. When they first got the place, there was an ancient cottonwood there, bigger than anything else for miles around. It grew right where Frank dug that well. Cottonwood trees love water, and if you see one growing but don't see a pond or creek nearby, you can bet that tree will have its roots into some moisture close to the surface. Knowing that, he felled that old tree, blasted out the stump, and dug straight down below its roots to make that well. I started to say something mundane about the cleverness of her distant in-law, but Lois interrupted me. It wasn't as smart as that, she declared. If Franklin Emerson had any sense, he never would have bought that property to begin with. This used to be native land, you know. I admitted that I had not known, although I most certainly had seen the Muskogee Nation Cemetery down the road, right next to the spring that gave the nearby municipality its appellation. The log cabin belonged to a woman named Leola Mabry, she continued. Leola Mabry was a young Indian woman at the time of the Cherokee Civil War. As one might suppose, there were quite a few orphans created along the Trail of Tears. She had lost most of her family on the journey from North Carolina herself. So, when the fighting broke out around Park Hill, Leola moved, and took a handful of displaced children with her. They built a cabin beside the Arkansas River, just above the floodline. This was before they built the dam and changed the course of the river. They were far removed from any kin, but this being Creek country, they hoped that the war wouldn't follow them. The orphans and Leola grew traditional crops on the river bottom. Corn, beans, pumpkins, gourds, sunflowers, sunchokes, ground cherries, and tobacco. This was before the arrival of the railroad, so the place over to the north of the property was still wilderness, and game was plentiful enough to supplement their diet. Little Joe Creek ran right beside the cabin. When they laid down the track bed for the KD line, they moved the creek a mile to the east, but there was no one living there by then. By the time Leola's children had grown into young men and women themselves, the American Civil War had broken out. Stan Watty took command of the 1st Cherokee Mounted Rifle Regiment for the Confederacy, and it appeared that a new wave of orphans was imminent. So they built a new house for those dependents just up the hill from the Sandy Spring. Leola expanded the garden into a full-sized farm in order to accommodate the additional mouths, but there wasn't enough wild game left in the area to provide the meat. In order to earn the money to barter for beef, they grew a native corn and sold it for the making of whiskey. Territorial law made it illegal for a native woman to grow corn for whiskey, but there were loopholes. The merchant that Leola traded with was of a disagreeable sort. and being himself a teetotaler, made every opportunity to heap scorn upon the heads of the heathen farmers and the demon drink. But he bought the corn all the same, and sold it at an enormous markup to the distiller, making his profit from the devil's trade, as he called it. To further supplement their income, the main orphanage took in washing from the small town that was growing nearby, and Leola did mending work at the cabin. If you can imagine it, there was Joe Creek, running close by the cabin, and that huge cottonwood tree was growing beside it. One year, late in May, a family of crows built a nest up in that tree, which was massive, even then. One might consider the arrival of the crows to be an ill omen, given the modern disposition, but for the Cherokee, crows symbolized wisdom and good fortune, and so their presence didn't disturb Miss Mabry in the least. She could close her eyes and envision what their view of the valley must be like, all the way up in the treetops. This was only a flight of fancy, mind you, not some supernatural native magic, although what happened later is like to give a body a stir. Lois looked over at me, surely attempting to gauge my reaction, but as you recall, I had just become accustomed to the idea of ghostly children playing with marbles in my backyard, so I was neither shaken nor put off by this turn. I leaned in closer, and she appraised my interest while availing herself to another sip of tea. Once fortified, my neighbor continued her story. The middle of July was a busy time on Loyola's farm. The first harvest of corn was in and drying, and the time had come to get the second one planted. The field was irrigated from the adjacent creek, and the wheel that lifted the water out required daily attention. Picture a hub with 8 pairs of spokes, just about twice the height of a man. Between each couple hung a long trough swinging freely. Stones had been piled up along the banks on either side of the creek to restrict the flow, increasing its speed and depth. The bucket-like troughs caught the rushing torrent and turned the wheel around, carrying a bit of the muddy water up and over the top. Before reaching the apex of the wheel, a sturdy peg struck the top of the trough, causing it to tip over into the irrigation sluice. The work had been done by Loyola's first set of children, with horses, shovels, and plows. They carved out a second path to the river from Joe Creek about half a mile west of here, and set up a gate on that end to control the flow. Even years later, they still call the fork Little Joe Creek, even if it is dry most of the time. The water wheel was set up by a smith from downriver. I don't recall his name, but Leola watched him put the contraption together, so she was familiar with everything that could go wrong with it. If the buckets and axle were properly lubricated, they would squeak just a little bit. The tipping peg would impact a thick strap of leather on the top of the buckets, making a muffled thump, and the water flowing down the sluice would make a short rush before going on out to the field. If everything was running properly, she could hear it from within the cabin. Squeak, thump, slosh. Squeak, thump, slosh. If she couldn't hear the water rushing into the sluice, it meant that there was some kind of an obstruction that was diverting a portion of it away. A short climb up a ladder and some manual labor to clear the sluice would be in order. A loud clack indicated that a strap had come loose and the peg was hammering the lip of a bucket. Too many impacts like that could damage the wooden trough, and a fresh piece of leather needed to be tacked on as soon as possible. One morning, right around the time they were getting the second crop of corn in the ground, Leola woke to an awful, grating, whining sound, and that could only mean the main axle was in need of greasing. After finishing her normal morning routine, she grabbed a couple of jars of old lard, tossed them into a bucket along with a handful of rags, and marched towards the sound of the racket. The path to the water wheel wound around mulberry and redbud trees and was constantly being invaded by errant pumpkin vines that grew thick on either side. Loath to put down her load to deal with the nuisance, she kicked them to the edge of the path as she went. Screech, thump, slosh, screech, thump, slosh was all she could hear as she passed the cottonwood, launching flowering vines with her feet to the dismay of the local bumblebee population. A footbridge crossed the stream below the wheel, allowing access to the sluice when cleaning was required, and a means of reaching the axle on the far side when its bearings needed to be serviced. Although the day was already turning hot, the spray from below the water wheel was refreshing and cool, and if not for the din caused by the dry wheel bearings, she would have liked to remain there for a bit longer. Lubricating the bearings of the wheel was not a complicated task. A minute or two with some rancid lard, a rag, and a stick to apply it with was all the chore required. Soon the screeching whine dissipated, and the rhythmic squeak, thump, and slosh resumed. Water from Little Joe Creek ran down the sluice to a raised pond just a little higher than the surrounding field. That pond had its banks right there where your front yard is, Lois said, shooting a glance in my direction. I nodded, thinking of all the clay that I'd found in the front yard in an area otherwise surrounded with sand. The ground there was still notably higher than the surrounding land, and it took little effort to conjure the mental image of the irrigation pond as it once would have been. Filled in, it had become the foundation for our house. Lois made the acquaintance of her cup again before continuing. The cottonwood had set its roots down across one whole side of the pond and grown tall and wide from it. Most of the path back from the water wheel to the cabin fell under its shade. As Leola made her way along that route, she noticed a stirring among the pumpkin vines that she had kicked aside previously. Rabbit? Squirrel? Grouse? It was as likely to be any of the three, although grouse was a much more wishful thought on her part. There was a muzzle-loading shotgun down at the cabin for taking such game, but all she was armed with at that particular moment was an old wooden bucket. Undaunted, she waded into the tangle of vines in pursuit of her quarry. What she found beneath the broad leaves beneath the cottonwood tree was no rabbit or squirrel. It was a young crow, barely fledged, with a twisted left foot. The injured animal kept attempting to stand, beating with its wings, but the injury made the feat impossible. Struggling in the vines throughout the night, it had weakened considerably, and would likely have continued to lie still if Leola's kick had not disturbed it. "You'd better come with me," she said, setting down her bucket and looking for a rag suitable for wrapping around the bird. The crow, for his part, remained on the ground, panting rapidly, but not moving. Leola found a torn towel, cast off by its former owner as unworthy of repair, and used it to swallow the bird up. Once the crow had been secured safely, she placed him in her bucket and returned to the cabin with patient in hand. The crow's parents were absent, and the nest up in the cottonwood tree was otherwise silent. Over the course of the next few days, and while examining her charge's injuries, Leola began to piece together what must have happened. A pair of hawks had found the nest unguarded and came to make a meal of the young. The crow that she had found made his escape from the nest, but encountered a snag on the way down, catching his foot. He must have struggled up in that tree for some time before the ankle joint broke, and the muscles and tendons of the same leg had been badly strained. Several flight plumes were missing as well, either snatched out during the initial assault or lost to thrashing about in the snag. There didn't appear to be any other wounds, so Leola made a splint for the broken ankle and set the disabled avian in a large laundry basket as a surrogate nest. Over the next 2 years, Leola observed the crows and hawks engage in a war over the cottonwood tree. First the raptors came to make use of the nesting site, and then the crows would arrive to drive them out and give their young the same treatment that they had been served with. The crows would attempt a nest of their own, only to have their eggs thieved by hawks, and during all of this time, the bird that Leola had rescued lived with her in her cabin. She named him Koga, which simply means crow in Chaligi. Once Leola was certain that the splint on Koga's ankle was secure and that he wouldn't hurt himself, she removed the towel from about his wings and let him have free run of the laundry basket. In order to feed the young crow, she cut a short length of bamboo to make a straw, then ground dry corn into a fine meal. While grinding the corn, Leola put a kettle of water on the stove to boil. Once the corn was ground and the water hot, she mixed the two to make a thin sort of gruel and fed it to Koga using a bamboo straw. Eventually, she would begin feeding him on scraps of her own meals, and he would join her at the table to the amusement of guests. By the middle of winter the first year, Koga's foot had healed enough to remove the splint. The bird was comfortable around Leola by this time, and was able to hop and fly about the cabin when the mood suited him. As Leola did her chores about the house, he watched. Of particular interest to Koga was the large hat box that Leola kept, full of odd buttons for mending work. When a piece came in that required replacement buttons, she poured them out on the table to sort through, looking for the closest match. Once the work was done, she gathered up all of the extra buttons and returned them to the box. The laundry business of the orphanage included a rag-picking business, and all of the surplus buttons and zippers from that enterprise came down to the cabin to join Leola's collection. Typically, the deliveries were conducted by a girl named Carol, the youngest of the original orphans that had come to the valley with Leola at the beginning. By springtime, households were busily involved with their annual vernal cleaning. More mending jobs were coming in than ever before, and Carol made the trek down the hill 3 times a week to keep up with the volume. The sight of the maid carrying an oversized wicker basket full of mending always brought a smile to Leola's face. During the journey from back east, Carol was only an infant, and she had lost her mother and father along the way. Leola had carried her to Park Hill in a basket woven out of river cane. Leola was the only parent she had ever known. "I'm home, Mother," she would shout as she approached the cabin, turning sideways so that the basket wouldn't block her voice. Since the end of December, she had been seeing a boy from the other side of the fort, just down the river a ways, and her visits were coming earlier and earlier in order to fit a walk down to the general store into the affair. One afternoon she arrived just as Leola was trimming off the excess thread from the last of the button replacements. As usual, Koga was sitting on the back of one of the chairs around the big table, observing the work intently. Leola rose to open the cabin door, letting her daughter in. "I declare, you must be getting up before the roosters in order to get down here so quick," Leola scolded. "And off to hang about with that Perryman boy again, no doubt." "Oh, Mother, don't start," Carol said, setting the basket down beside the doorstep. This was not the first time that they'd had this sort of conversation. "3/4 white, the other quarter's muskogee, not Genevieve," Leola snorted. "Well, he's real enough for me," Carol shot back a little heatedly, "and it's not like there are a lot of eligible bachelors from the 7 clans all the way out here." "Look, I know he says nice things and gives you candy," Leola sighed, "but it was a boy just like him that had you by the ankle, about to bash your head against a tree to keep you from crying before I stopped him. He gave the girls candy, too." Koga's voice erupted from the kitchen table. The women stopped arguing and turned towards the source of the interruption. The young crow had hopped down from the seat back and was now standing on the table. He tilted his ebon head from one side to the other, looked at the women, and picked up a button with his beak and dropped it into the tin. Shocked into silence, Leola and Carol watched Koga pick up another button, and then another. After a moment, Leola came over to the table, patted Koga's head, and quietly began putting away the buttons herself. "I'm sorry, daughter of mine," she said, as the last remaining button went into the tin. "Just please be careful with that boy." "I will, Mother. I always do." From that time on, whenever a button or thimble fell on the cabin floor, Koga was there to pick it up and return it to its rightful place. The bird followed Leola about as she did her chores, weeded the garden, and serviced the water wheel. You might envision a young crow riding on an Indian woman's shoulder like a parrot, and he did perch there sometimes. But most of the time, he found a high vantage point nearby to keep watch over her as she went about her business. People began to talk about that Indian woman on the west side and her infernal bird. You know the way people are when they see something that they just don't understand. "Wait a second there," I interrupted. "Are you saying that the West Side Witch was just an old lady with a bird and a bunch of orphans?" The tales of the West Side Witch were popular fare for local school-aged boys and girls and featured heavily in the town's annual haunted house, set up in the strip mall, of course. They say it's one of the top 5 such attractions in the country. "They say a lot of things," Lois responded. "Over time, the story has become mixed together, forgotten, reinvented, and embellished. It's likely that someone saw Koga pick up a coin and bring it to Leola, but to hear the story the kids tell these days, she was using the dark arts to compel animals to do her bidding, sending them into people's houses to steal their silver at night, and such nonsense. None of that happened, and they didn't burn her at the stake either. The real story is strange enough. Now, where was I? Oh, yes. All through that summer, Koga followed Leola. When the time for the crows to migrate came, he didn't fly away south, but remained indoors with her. Now, the thing that most people don't know about birds in general, and crows in particular, are their social habits. Crows mature in about 2 years, but up until that time, the juveniles will remain with their family group. Often they remain even once they reach mating age. Because Koga considered Leola to be his family, if she was not migrating, he wasn't either. All the same, people talk. The laundry business diminished somewhat, and Leola was obliged to increase the corn production. The buyer might grumble about that demon bird, but he knew Leola's corn made the best whiskey, and he would pay for it too. Growing more corn meant more time in the field, and Koga came along with her. When Leola was pulling up pigweed and lamb's quarter, the crow would be there, hunting grasshoppers, or mimicking her, pulling up bits of grass. Leola didn't think much of it. He was always trying to help, it seemed. It did worry her a bit that he might not return to his proper family as he grew, and she kept watch for the crows to return to the giant cottonwood. Koga began to fly farther and farther out, sometimes leaving Leola alone in the cornfield for most of the day. She took these excursions as a good sign that soon he would become reacquainted with his wild relatives and join them on their migration. Sure enough, one day came when Koga didn't return from the field. She hoped this meant that he had found a nice girl crow out there and was heading south to get to know her better. Still, she looked for Koga and the other crows, particularly up in that cottonwood tree, but they didn't return that year, or even the next. Farther south, crows can remain in one place all year round. In this part of the world, they'll establish a nesting area for a few years, then abandon it when a hard year comes, only to come back later. That winter, and the one afterwards, were like that. Do you recall the ice storm in '07? Imagine 2 years like that, back to back. By the next spring, the cottonwood was battered and half dead, but that was when the crows returned. Leola had thought that she would recognize Kugga, or that he would show some sign of recognition when he saw her. But she discovered that she couldn't distinguish any difference in these birds at all. They perched up in the twisted, broken limbs of the cottonwood tree and watched her work in her garden. She took sticks from the ice-damaged limbs and drove them into the ground, all in rows, and the crows watched. She dug a shallow furrow beside the row of sticks and planted peas there. Leola half expected one of the crows to come down and visit with her, but they just perched and watched. They watched as she closed the furrow, burying the peas. They watched as she took the empty gourd bowl that the dry peas had been kept in and placed it on the porch of her cabin. They watched, but remained silent up in that twisted cottonwood tree. The very next morning when Leola stepped outside, she found mud all over the porch in a pattern of tiny clawed feet. The gourd bowl was full of peas again, slightly dirty peas that looked as if they had been buried and then dug up. Leola rushed out to the garden, and there she saw that all of the furrows had been pecked apart. The peas in the bowl were indeed the same ones that she had just planted the day before. Up in the cottonwood tree, the crows just sat, murmuring among each other in the usual speech of crows. They murmured, they muttered, and they watched as Leola planted her peas for the second time. Once she was done, Leola returned to the cabin and swept the porch clean. This happened every night for 3 nights in a row. On the 4th night, Leola set up a chair beside the garden and took up watch to see what was transpiring. The sun set and dusk fell. Although it was a clear night, the stars did little to illuminate the garden. Up in the cottonwood tree, the birds were silent. Right around midnight, the moon began to rise. In the clear night, the moon lit up the garden as well as a streetlight, and up in the tree, the crows began to stir. One by one, they dropped down from the branches and began walking about the garden, hunting for peas. Leola was certain that she had dozed off for a moment and had awakened as the moon began to rise. The disorientation that she felt upon awaking in a strange environment must have made what she was witnessing seem like a dream. For several moments she could do nothing but watch as the crows went about the garden, digging her peas out and flying off to the cabin to deposit them on the porch. Determined to put an end to this prank, she lifted her shotgun and fired. There was no shot in the gun, just powder and wadding. Even so, it was sufficient to disrupt the birds, and they abandoned the cottonwood for the evening. They didn't return the next day, or even the day after, and Leola thought the affair was over and done with. She told no one about what had happened, except to say that she had been obliged to shoot at some varmints. The particulars of the story didn't emerge until much later. Whether the birds were just trying to be helpful, or playing some kind of game didn't matter anymore. That shot in the dark was a declaration of war, and crows, well, crows hold a grudge. Lois leaned in, and her voice took on a hushed tone, not a whisper, but almost. "I wonder about it sometimes," she said. "The why of it?" I shook my head, not knowing what to say. The entire story was strange to me. "Best I can figure," she mused, "is that crow must have gone south someplace warm and made it there. Since he'd grown up accustomed to artificial light, he must have used that adaptation to his advantage, raiding dumpsters in cities at night by the light of street lamps. The next generation would have learned to do the same. It sounds crazy, but I looked it up. Houston had street lighting all the way back in 1882, and get this, one of the papers of the period reported that locals are concerned the new lighting is disturbing the nesting patterns of migratory birds. They had environmentalists even back then, it seems," she chuckled. The crows never came back to the cottonwood tree. But if you like to garden, as I know you do, then you'll know that the time for planting early peas and the time for planting corn falls about 28 days apart. So the corn would be planted under a similar moon. They had every square foot of that valley planted. And wouldn't you know it, the crows came under the light of that planter's moon and ate up every seed. They tried again, put every last seed they had in the soil, but the crows came back when the moon rose and took the seeds again. The orphanage closed its doors that December, and all of the misplaced children were shuffled off to other institutions. State-run boarding schools where they'd be beaten for speaking anything but English or worse. Catholic charities where they'd be punished for going by their birth names instead of the Christian aliases the nuns provided them with. The orphanage sat abandoned for a good 40 years or more until a wealthy industrialist bought the place. And the cabin was demolished as a hazard when they ran the KD railroad line through. The channel to the water wheel was cut off, and Little Joe Creek filled in over time, as did the irrigation pond. The old cottonwood remained there, all the way up until Emerson cut it down, as you already know. As for Leola, I hear that after the bank took over the place, she wound up avoiding the spinster life by marrying a merchant's son herself. Their old house used to settle on the east bank of the Arkansas River where the Creek Nation Casino is today. Haunted? Well, the land sure has the history for it. I've never had any trouble, but I don't leave the house after dark, and I don't go digging around the old place either. If some antique marbles and ghost children are all you have to deal with, count yourselves fortunate. I don't suppose there's any chance of getting out of your mortgage. Not much, I admitted. It's a $20,000 house. We took a note for $30 to buy it. The neighborhood average is $40, but no one will pay more than $10 for it. All the same, it is home, and I should be headed there directly. Thanks for the history lesson, ma'am. I took my leave and made my way home. Along the way, I passed a giant sycamore that towered over everything else in the valley for miles. Huge as it was, and believe me, this tree is a real giant, it would have been barely a sapling when the cottonwood came down. There are nests up in its high branches, quite a few of them. Over the years that we've been here, I've seen it occupied by both hawks and crows in turn. I credit the hawks with wiping out our chicken population and leading us to raise ducks instead. I suppose I should thank them. I had worried that the crows would come down and eat my strawberries or engage in some other sinister activity, but they always seem to be uninterested in whatever I'm doing. I should be thankful for that too, I thought to myself. That was the last time I ever saw Lois. They say she signed her deed over to the state and had them move her into a full-time care facility for the elderly. A younger couple lives there now, and bless their hearts, they're trying to raise a few chickens out here. Well, they'll learn soon enough, I reckon. As you know, I've been expanding the garden bit by bit, and we installed a new raised bed for planting our garlic in. Enough for a year's supply for us, and some extra to sell. I even went so far as to get a special sifter to separate the grass roots from the soil to fill the beds. It separates the rocks and debris, too. Bits of broken glass and such, old nails, a horseshoe, more railroad spikes. I haven't found any more marbles, nor can I show you any. They vanished, as I told you before, just like they'd never been there at all. My doctor tells me that the entire incident was brought on by stress and anxiety attached to becoming a homeowner. I guess that's as good of a rational explanation as I need, but I'm not taking those pills. They might take away anxiety, but the side effects are awful. I'd rather have the occasional feeling of anxiousness, thank you very much. To that end, I'd like to ask you for your help. You see, I'm concerned that I may be letting my mind play tricks on me again. Allow me to properly explain. Recently, I felt as though the crows were watching me work in the garden. Now I'm sure that they're just going about their business, doing normal crow stuff, and my doctor agrees that this is all just the product of an overly active imagination, and asks if I'm taking the meds that he prescribed. Just nerves, right? Right. I've been finding something else with the sifter, though, and that made me think of the story that Lois told me. But what I really need to know is, can you see them too? Enclosed, please find one photograph, close-up of hand, palm up, holding 3 old buttons.